Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the 2022 Niagara Children's Water Festival this morning. My name is Zach Fryer and I'm from Niagara Region Waste Management, and today we're going to talk to you all about wetlands and how we can make sure we keep them clean. And as we do learn about the significance of water this week, let us also reflect on the land on which we gather, understand the history of the land on which we live, and that provides us with this precious resource of water. Niagara Region is situated on treaty land. This land is steeped in the rich history of the First Nations such as the Hattaway-Wendourong, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. There are many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people from across Turtle Island that live and work in Niagara today. And the Niagara Children's Water Festival stands with all Indigenous peoples, past and present, in promoting the wise stewardship of the lands on which we live and of the water which sustains us. And as we do start to talk about water, wetlands are a very important part of our water system. So start off, let's go, what is a wetland? So a wetland is any kind of low-lying area where water can cover the surface of the soil at some point in the year. So it may look a little bit familiar, like one of these photos you see here. And you may have seen one of these before, maybe not too far from your own house. Due to a lot of this water, and wetlands can kind of hold on to a lot of water for an extended period of time, they tend to just look like rivers or lakes, but there's a lot more to wetlands than it may appear on the surface. And they're a very, very important part of our ecosystems here in Niagara Region. And wetlands may actually not be too far from where you are. We are very fortunate in Niagara. We have a number of wetlands near us, some of the main ones being the Wainfleet Wetland, the Humberstone Marsh, the Willoughby Marsh, and Niagara Falls. So wherever you are in the region, there's chances are there's one not too far from your own backyard that you can check out after this. And why wetlands are important? Well, wetlands have a lot of different animals in them, ranging from mammals like moose and beavers to lots of freshwater fish and birds like blue herons, and even a couple of endangered species like the painted turtle. So it's really important that we protect these wetlands to make sure we protect all of that rich biodiversity that we have right in our backyards. And when we think about wetlands, you know, some people like to just think they're all the same, but there actually are different types of wetlands in Niagara Region. So some of the most common ones, we have a marsh. So these are the ones you typically see. They have the really tall grasses and usually kind of near a river. These might be the ones you typically maybe see someone canoeing on if it happens to be near a park or somewhere like that. Swamps tend to be the ones that people traditionally think of when they hear the word wetland. These ones tend to have a lot of really tall trees, and because of that, those trees can hold on to a lot of the water for a much, much longer time. And kind of opposite to that, we have something called a fen. So this has mostly grasses, reeds, and kind of smaller shrubs. And shrubs are just kind of the really tiny plants that you typically see. So they can't hold on to water very well. So water tends to flow pretty freely through a fen like that. And then the last one that you may have seen in your backyard is a bog. This is another one that people tend to think of off the top of their head when they hear the word wetland. So these ones are very spongy. They have a lot of wet soil that can absorb a lot of water. And because of that, the water doesn't move very fast. It's very still, which for a lot of species makes it perfect for them to grow up in. Now, when we talk about wetlands, the biggest question of all is, why are wetlands so important? Why do we care about them? Well, as I mentioned earlier, wetlands are in a low-lying area, and where does water like to go? It likes to go downhill with gravity, and when all that water pools, that's when we get our wetlands. And wetlands play a really important role with flooding, actually. So because we have so much soil and trees and shrubbery, it can hold on to that water. And you may know, you may be living near a wetland yourself. We have sometimes towns and villages that are near wetlands, and when we have really heavy storms or a lot of rain, wetlands do a really good job of preventing flooding from hitting our towns and villages that live near these wetlands. And the other thing they're really, really good at is they're really good at filtering the water that comes through. There's so many animals and plants to hold on and filter that water as it comes through, that by the time it gets to our drinking water supplies, it's much, much cleaner than when it came down already. So it's very, very important not only for our own safety for flooding, but also making sure we have a lot of clean water that we can use whenever we need access to it. Now, I'm obviously from waste management, so you might be thinking, well, what does this have to do with waste? Well, some of you maybe have visited a landfill before, and you may be familiar with this a little bit. A landfill is what we use for our garbage that cannot be recycled or broken down and compost with organics. So in a landfill, it's essentially a very large hole that all of our garbage kind of gets buried in and left there for us to store. Now, when it rains or we have a really big storm over a landfill, we have water coming down from the clouds and it hits the garbage on the landfill. And when it gets to the ground, it starts running through the garbage down as it makes its way down to the soil. And what it can do sometimes is as it's going down and passing over things, it can pick up toxic materials or chemicals or something like that, and it becomes something we call leachate. And what leachate can do is when it gets down to the soil, it gets absorbed into the soil, it starts making its way down into something called the groundwater. And groundwater is something very, very important to us and our drinking water supply. Some people are still getting their water on wells, so they get it right from the ground, or we use groundwater to feed some of our own drinking water plants and facilities. So it's very important that we make sure all the material we're throwing out does not harm our groundwater through leachate like that. And this is another reason why it's very important we make sure we're mindful of waste when it comes to wetlands. You may have seen this before when you're hiking on a trail, or maybe you were in a wetland on a trip, but you see litter and garbage kind of littering the ground and all that kind of stuff. And we do try our best to make sure that doesn't happen. You may have seen on your streets, you have little grates to make sure that only water goes down our storm sewers, but sometimes things still slip through and they get deposited into a wetland through like a larger drain like the one on the right, and that can harm the wildlife. They may think it's pretty shiny and they think it's something to eat, or they get stuck in it, or something happens like that. So sorting our waste is really, really important to making sure we protect our wetlands. And that is why we are going to go over a little bit of our sorting stuff today. Now, you may be familiar if you help out your mom and dad with sorting throughout the year. We have a couple of different bins we use in Niagara Region. We use a green bin, which is a taller one we use for our compost, and we have two recycling boxes, a gray bin and a blue bin that we use for all of our recyclable materials. And we're going to go over that real quick. So the first one, you have the blue box, so you may recognize this one. In this box, you typically find things like bottles, cans, plastic packaging, any kind of glass that can go in there. They all go into our blue box, which gets taken to our recycling center in Niagara Falls, and this can make sure it all gets turned into brand new products. And it's really important when you're doing recycling with these items that you make sure they're clean, because we don't want any food or liquid or anything kind of messing up the process when we're recycling them. And the same kind of goes for the gray box too. So the gray box is also recyclable material, and it goes to our facility in Niagara Falls. We made into new things, but it's a little bit different in terms of what it accepts. So these are for things like newspapers, cardboard, any kind of stretchy plastic bags like a grocery bag, all go into the gray box, which still gets recycled into new things. And it's important we make sure those things stay clean too, to make sure we can turn them into new things. And the third stream that we use to get material out of our garbage is our green bin. This is typically also referred to as the organics bin. So any kind of food scraps, fruit, veggies, meat, dairy, all of that can go into our green bin, as well as some non-food items too. So things like napkins, paper towels, tissue, construction paper, all of those, and leaf and yard waste like small leaves and little twigs can go in there too. And with our green bin, it goes to our composting facility and it gets broken down into compost, which we can then use to fertilize our gardens and make sure that we're returning all of that those good nutrients from all that food leftovers back into the soil. And that's it for us from the Region for Waste Management. But before we go quite yet, I'm going to invite my friend Camille over, and we are going to see if you guys are paying attention, and we're going to play a little sorting game to see if you guys know how to sort your waste properly. So Camille, why don't you come on over, and we'll get our bins set up. Good morning, Camille.
Good morning.
How are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm fantastic. So we're just going to set up our bins here real quick. So these are the bins that I just told you guys about a couple minutes ago. So we've got our tall green bin here that's used for our compost, and we've got our two recycling boxes that are used for different types of materials. So, and we've got our tiny, teeny little garbage caddy right in front, for anything that cannot be recycled or organics. And it's small because we want to make sure that that stream is as small as possible to make sure we save space in our landfill. So what do we have first, Camille? Ooh, we got some good items here. So let's see. So first off, we've got a milk carton. So this one may be a little bit tricky, but take about 10-15 seconds amongst yourselves. See if you can guess which bin it goes in. Does it go in the green bin for organics? Or does it go in the recycling in one of our two bins? Or maybe it goes in the garbage. Just take your best guesses. These cartons are typically made out of plastic with a little bit of a liner inside. So it may be a little tricky. We'll give you about 5 more seconds to pick a bin, see where you want it. And the correct answer is it goes into the blue box. So these kind of containers, along with like juice containers, milk cartons, juice cartons, all those things go into the blue box because we can separate the layers of the plastic and the more papery stuff at our recycling facility to make sure that it gets recycled. So it goes into the blue box with all of our containers and our glass and cans.
Awesome.
All right, what do we got next, Camille?
So as a next item, I have a newspaper here. So I know we all know what newspaper is. I know we all see it pretty frequently. So it's just pretty standard paper, pretty flimsy, pretty thin. So I'll give you guys a chance to think about where it could go. We have our gray bin, which is typically for paper products. We have our blue bin, which is typically for our plastics. We have our compost for organics. And then we also have our garbage bin just right at the front here. So I'll let you guys think about it for a second and decide and talk amongst yourselves and see.
Yeah, I think you guys will get this one. This one's
so.
a little bit easier than the first one. We gave you a little bit of an easier one for this one.
So, if you said gray bin, you would be correct. We are able to turn paper into other paper materials fairly easily at our recycling center.
Right, so let's see what we've got next. You can take that, Camille. Okay, so this one might be a little tricky again. So we have a disposable coffee cup. So you and your parents may get these all the time if you get some coffee or hot chocolate or something like that. So these things typically have paper, but they also have a plastic liner on the inside to make sure they don't leak. So it might throw you off a little bit. So where is this going to go? Is it going to go in the organics, one of our recycling bins, or is it going to go into our garbage down here? Give you guys about 10 seconds to figure that out. Discuss amongst yourselves, see if anyone can figure out the trick. Anyone can figure out the trick? 5 more seconds. See if you figured it out. So these cups actually go into the garbage. We actually can't recycle these because of that plastic liner that's on the inside. We actually can't separate it. So it has to go in the garbage and we can't. That is why we always try to make sure, encourage you guys to bring reusable mugs and reusable things to bring your drinks in. Let's put this in here. All right, what do we got next, Camille?
So another item that we have today is a green piece of construction paper. This is a bit of a tough one. It is a paper material. It's fairly thin, fairly flimsy. Zach did mention it though in his presentation with where we do end up putting these. So I'll give you guys a moment to kind of think about it and discuss it amongst yourselves. We have our paper recycling bin. We have our plastic recycling bin, which is the blue box, the green compost bin over here, or the waste bin just right at the front. So I'll let you guys think about where you're thinking you'd put this. And if you said the compost, you would be correct. Because it's so thin and it is very easy to kind of break apart, it does go in our compost bin with other organics.
It does. That was a bit of a tricky one, but remember, there are things that are not food that goes in the green bin too. And we've got our last item here. We're done with this bag because we've disposed of all our other material correctly. So now we got to get rid of the bag. So I have a plastic grocery bag. It's a stretchy plastic bag. Where do you guys think this goes? Does it go in our organics, one of our recycling, or maybe it goes in the garbage? I'll give you about 10 seconds to decide on this one. I did mention this one too when we talked about what goes where, so see if you were paying attention or if you just kind of know from helping out your parents maybe with their recycling and their waste. About 5 more seconds. And if you were one of the people who said this goes into our gray box, then you are correct. So plastic bags go into our gray box. And specifically, though, it's stretchy plastic bags. If you notice with these grocery bags, I can kind of put my finger through it, and it kind of stretches a little bit that you see. That's how you know it goes into the gray box. If you try this out with something like a chip bag and it doesn't stretch, it actually goes into the garbage. So it's really important you just do that little stretch test before you throw it into one of the bins to make sure you're throwing it out properly and it goes into our recycling. And that's about it for our recycling and organic sorting quiz. So we hope you guys enjoyed and learned some new stuff about waste. And if any of you have any questions for us, we'd be more than happy to help you out and answer them.
Was awesome. So we actually do have a couple questions. So from Mrs. Brown's grade 4 class, they're asking, what is the biggest wetland in Niagara and how big is it?
That's a good question. So the largest one we have in Niagara is the Willoughby Marsh in Niagara Falls. It's about 550 acres. And to get an idea of how big that is, a typical house in your neighborhood maybe is about 1 acre if you have a nice big backyard. So take around that size times 550. It's really, really large. But it's also not the only wetland we have in Niagara, as I mentioned. So we're really fortunate. We have a lot of, even if they're smaller, they still are just as important as the Willoughby Marsh. And we're very fortunate in Niagara. We have a lot of different wetlands that we can visit and enjoy it right in your backyards.
That's awesome. And that also means we probably have a lot of different species we can check out too.
Absolutely, they do.
Perfect. So our next question is actually from Mrs. Clark's grade 3 class. And they're wondering, are all animals who live in wetlands endangered?
That's a really good question. You guys have some really good questions this morning. So not necessarily all animals are endangered. There definitely are some endangered species that like to call wetlands home. So I mentioned earlier we have species like the painted turtle that are endangered species, which makes it very important to protect our wetlands. But also wetlands kind of as a whole and as a habitat are actually pretty endangered too. The sizes of the wetlands that we have in Niagara and in Ontario have been shrinking over the last few years. And as I mentioned before, not only do they have so many different animals that call them home, but also it's really important for filtering our water and making sure to prevent flooding around our towns that are built near wetlands. So it's really, really important that we protect the wetlands themselves just as much as we protect the animals that live in the wetlands as well.
Very good point, Zach. And from Mr. Bell's grade 4 class, they're wondering, where do those hazardous materials like paint and batteries get disposed?
Well, that's also a good question. Camille, you want to answer this one?
Yes, so that is a great question. So when you do dispose of those items, they don't belong at the curb. They are hazardous and they might have some toxins and some not so great things inside of them. So we prefer if you bring it to our special places that we have that are located at the landfills. They're called hazardous waste depots, and there they can properly sort them and properly dispose of them so that nothing gets hurt and that our environment stays nice and clean.
Awesome, great information. And if you guys want to go to visit one of those depots, you just ask your parents to drive you. So from Miss Anderson's grade 3-4 class, they're asking, what happens when a landfill gets filled?
That is a really, really good question because a lot of people don't think about our waste once it goes to the landfill. So as I kind of mentioned before, a landfill is almost like a really large hole that we put our waste in and gets buried. So when they get full, we usually typically try to bury them under some soil. And what happens from there is we have a lot of people on our teams that make sure that everything is going to be safe for the environment. So we check to make sure that there's no, as I mentioned, leachate earlier. We make sure there's nothing seeping out of the landfill into the soil, into that groundwater. And we monitor those for a really long time to make sure that even long after the landfills are closed, that they're not doing any harm to the environment or any animals or any people that might live near that closed landfill as well. And we always try to make sure when we do build landfills, we build like liners and stuff like that into the pits that the landfill is made out of to try and limit that as much as we can. And then the other thing that we can do as well, if some of you, one of the bigger ones we have is if any of you live near St. Catharines, the Glenridge Naturalization Site is a good example of one. We can turn these into what we call a naturalization site, which is an old landfill that we've turned back into public space. It's a park that people can go to. They can hike, they can walk their dogs, they can play some games, any kind of things like that. So we are at least able, even once the landfill is closed, we can take that land back and use it again for just outdoor purposes, even long after the landfills are closed.
Awesome. I'm glad it's such a circular thing. From Miss Sullivan's grade 2-3 class, they're asking, why do plastic bags go in the gray bin?
Yes, that is another great question because I know it's kind of confusing. As we know, the blue box is typically for our plastics, but we like to ask that we put our stretchy grocery bags into the gray bin to keep them as clean as possible, just because sometimes with the blue bin it gets mixed up and not everybody can rinse their cans and things like that. So to keep them clean and easily sorted, we ask that you do bunch them and put them in your gray bin so that they can just be taken off and recycled into new things.
Awesome, that's great information. I definitely didn't know that. And from Mrs. Nash's grade 4 class, they're asking, are wetlands ever dry, and is that a problem?
Not too often. There are some wetlands where the water levels may be lower at some points in the year and then it goes higher just because some points of the year we get a lot more rain than others. And it's not necessarily a problem because those are pretty normal. We have those fluctuations in water. But when it starts being a problem is if it's dried out for a long period of time, which as the temperature has been getting warmer in the last couple of years does start to be a concern for a couple of things. So it's because a lot of the plants and animals that have lived in these wetlands rely on there being that water source and it being very wet. So when it's dry, it can kind of cause some problems for them. But we're trying to make sure that we can limit those fluctuations as much as possible to make sure that if it does get a little dry, the water comes back not too long after.
Perfect. I'm glad that that's how that works. And great question for Mrs. Nash's class. For Mrs. Rogers' grade 2-3 class, they want to know, if you live in the country, what can you do to protect the environment properly?
That's a really good question. So there's a lot of great things you can do, and living in the country, you're kind of really close to the environment there. So what you can do is, we kind of mentioned before, you can make sure that you're sorting your waste properly. We had a question earlier, I think, about hazardous waste. So anything that could harm the environment, making sure all that's properly disposed of, to make sure that nothing leaks out into the soil or harms the animals in the environment in the area there. If you're going to be outdoors exploring and such, you know, if you happen to come across some litter, you know, maybe picking it up just so that it stays nice and clean, and making sure that when you're out there yourself, that you leave nothing behind as if you were never there. Just enjoy the sights and take it all in as well. And if you're curious about how some of this sorting works and all that kind of stuff later on, you can go to the Niagara Region's website, and there's a lot of good information about sorting and where all this stuff goes. It's niagararegion.ca/waste, and has a lot of good resources to help you guys out, learn what you can do long after this presentation.
Exactly. There's a lot of great information on that website, so make sure you check it out. Okay, from St. Gabriel's School, a grade 3-4 class, they ask, can wetlands grow in size?
Yeah, wetlands can grow in size just as much as they can shrink in size. It all depends on what's going on in the environment around them. A lot of times, we unfortunately have not seen that trend recently. We've kind of seen the opposite, where they're starting to shrink, whether that's because we start building a lot more houses and kind of spreading out in our cities and developing over that land, or you know, a lot of the climate change we've experienced recently, with it getting warmer, kind of shrinks those areas too. But they definitely can grow, and the more of them that we have, the more space there is for those species to grow, and the more capacity they have to filter all the water out, and the more flooding they can prevent, because they can take on more water the larger they are, which is why it's so important we protect them, because as they shrink, they can hold on to less water, which puts those towns at bit of a higher risk for flooding and any kind of stuff if we have a really, really big rainstorm or something.
Awesome. So Mr. Wales's class, his grade 4 class, has a couple questions for you. So about the landfills, are they secure? And what happens when there's heavy wind conditions, or is there any risk of materials getting out?
That's a really good question. You guys have some very good questions this morning. We're really impressed. Yeah, so landfills, we typically take a lot of steps to make sure that they're secure. So the holes that we dig are usually fairly deep in our landfills. So when there are high winds, sometimes you might find that when you or your parents come to drop some stuff off, the dropping off point may be closed, because that's a little bit more exposed and stuff can get blown around in the wind. But once it's actually in the landfill and it's in the ground, in the pits that we've buried, it's usually pretty secure from wind. And usually what we try to do with our landfills is we try to have you know, some trees or some kind of a barrier around the landfill to try and limit how much wind comes in. So the next time you're at the dump with your parents, take a look at what's around you, and usually you'll find it's not like a big flat area. There'll be some trees or some really tall vegetation kind of surrounding it. It's a little more secluded to try and keep those wind speeds down.
Absolutely. Great information and a great question for Mr. Wales's class. So we have one more question, and it's from Mrs. Stewart's grade 3-4 class, and they're wondering, if trash ever gets into the wetlands, who cleans it up?
That's also a really good question. So unfortunately, a lot of times it can go unnoticed, because these are typically very wooded or protected environmental areas. So sometimes you'll find, like, the conservation authorities and such do monitoring of these wetlands, even for non-trash related things like monitoring species. And if they see those materials, they'll, you know, sometimes try to clean them up and that kind of thing. But if you also happen to see them out and about while you're hiking and that, we encourage you guys to help take some steps to keep all that safe as well. And of course, the most important thing we can do is to make sure that trash never gets there in the first place. And the best way you can do that is using these bins here that we've talked about already, sorting your waste, making sure nothing gets littered or anything could possibly end up where it shouldn't be.
Awesome. That was great information and great questions, everyone. We have one more that just snuck through from Mrs. Taylor's grade 2-3 class, and they're wondering, how many endangered species are in the wetlands?
That is also a very good question. So there's a lot of endangered species. I don't have an exact number for you, unfortunately, but the best place you can go is if you go to the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority, who tends to do a lot more of this environmental conservation work. They may be able to help you out with an exact number, but there is a fair number of them. One, for example, I mentioned the turtle before, but almost all of the turtle species, for example, in Ontario are endangered in some way. So there's a lot more than you might think. So that's why, in addition to what I mentioned about the flooding and holding onto water and filtering water, it's also really important we protect those lands because there are a lot of endangered species, more than what I can name or what I know of as well, or we chatted about earlier today.
Exactly. Just like Zach said, there are tons of endangered species, and I think there's actually 8 species of turtles in Niagara that are endangered. But check out some of our other activity centers and you'll find out more about them. So, sorry guys, I have one more question for you.
Good. Questions are always great.
Awesome. So Mrs. Gianfrancisco's grade 3-4 class is wondering, what is the maximum water level for a wetland?
Well, there is no set maximum level necessarily that makes it a wetland or not. Kind of what makes a wetland is that at some point in the year, the water is above the soil level, and it's usually in a low-lying area because, again, water likes to go downhill, and that's how it collects super easily. So there's no set water level, just as long as there's kind of that fluctuation where the water is covering the soil at certain parts of the year that kind of makes it a wetland.
Awesome. And guys, I'm going to ask for a couple more questions here. They keep coming in.
Perfect.
So Miss Valence's grade 3-4 class, this is a tricky one. Are there any apex predators or predators in general in the wetlands that we have here in Niagara?
Ooh, that is a very good. You guys are really on point with the questions this morning. We're really impressed. I'm sure there are usually predators in the wetlands as well. So things like the bird species that we mentioned will usually prey on the fish and freshwater fish species that are in there as well. I don't know a ton of species off the top of my head, but there definitely are some predators just as much as there are prey in those areas because there are so many different types of species in wetlands. It'd be really hard to just find only one specific type of species in there because there's so much biodiversity in these environments.
Awesome. And last question, so again for Mrs. Gianfrancisco's grade 3-4 class, what happens if garbage is leaking out of a landfill?
That's a really good question. So typically it's not so much the actual garbage itself that's leaking out. That's usually pretty contained once we kind of bury over it and contain it. Usually what ends up seeping out, if anything, is what I had mentioned earlier, which was the leachate. So that's when we get a lot of rain and or a heavy storm and the water kind of trickles through all the materials and it picks up things as it goes through. That's typically what we're monitoring for when we're checking to make sure a landfill is safe. So we do regular monitoring to make sure that none of that is happening and nothing is seeping out. If we do find that maybe there's a seep somewhere or something is leaking out, we have teams that go out there to try and see and look at, where is this coming from? Is there something that needs to be replaced from what we've already built? Or is there something we've missed and there's something brand new we have to build? And usually I mentioned we try to put liners and that kind of thing in the landfills to kind of collect any of that material that does come through. So usually it's pretty good, but if it does escape, we try to capture it pretty quickly and make sure it goes into the collection systems we have that pick up any leachate that does happen to kind of run through our garbage.
Awesome. That was an amazing presentation, guys. Thank you so much, Zach and Camille, for your amazing work today. And thank you guys for watching and joining us here today at the 2022 Niagara Children's Water.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. And again, if you have any other questions about waste or sorting your waste, you can go to niagararegion.ca/waste, and you can find tons of good info there as well.